Hi, everyone, and welcome back to our series about raising awareness about domestic workers amongst the employers of domestic workers. I'm Juliana Good. I'm a student at Mamaroneck High School in the Original Civic Research and Action program, and I'm so excited to welcome three amazing and very knowledgeable guests about the subject. So if you guys could introduce yourselves.
Hi, thanks so much. My name is Ariana. I am the Director of Training at the Worker Institute for Worker Rights and Equity. Pleasure to be here.
My name is Janet Fry. I'm the Director of the Community Resource Center. My pleasure to be here as well.
Hi, my name is Christina Breurto, and I'm a staff attorney with the Worker Justice Center of New York.
Well, thank you guys all so much for being here, and thank you LMC Media for producing this podcast. So today's episode is about hours, paid time off, and overtime pay. So can you guys start off by explaining a little about domestic workers' rights regarding working hours? Are there standard work week limits that employers should be aware of? And do these limits differ when employees are paid off the books or on the books?
Sure, I can start. So a domestic worker is entitled to the same overtime pay generally as any other worker. So 40 hours a week is what they're allowed to be paid for their regular work week, and then overtime is any hour over 40. Unless, and there's a lot of unless in the law, so it's always important to, double check and triple check. Unless a domestic worker is living inside the home, then it's overtime pay after 44 hours a week. And the way that overtime pay is calculated is time and a half the regular hourly rate. Domestic workers are supposed to be paid an hourly rate, and then their overtime is time and a half that rate. Your second question was whether this differs if they're paid off the books. So whether they're paid on the books or off the books, they are still entitled to that pay under the law.
Got you. Can you talk a little, you guys have so much experience working firsthand with domestic workers in our community. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit about the effects when there is miscommunications and about overtime pay? How does that affect the work?
Yeah, absolutely. I can start a little bit. So we are part of an initiative called Care Forward, which is really how do we bring care forward, care for the whole community. When we raise standards for domestic workers, we raise standards for everyone. They are the ones that do the work that makes all work possible. And so Care Forward has really brought together allies, employers, community organizations, and workers themselves to think together about a framework for having conversations around negotiating these important issues, for thinking about how to create campaigns that are actually going to push standards forward, and then to really think about how do we enforce the standards that we want in our communities, and working with neighborhood standards boards here in Westchester County, there could be many, to really think about what does our neighborhood want to do about care? Do we care about care? And if we do, will we stand behind those values? And so one of the key issues that has come up is overtime, is one of the issues that's always hardest, I think, for employers to understand, hardest for workers to always understand. And so we've done a bunch of training, and we do a peer-based training model. So domestic workers themselves train other workers in how to do calculations, and then how to have conversations with their employers using the contract and using wage calculators to be able to really say, actually, I work these hours, and I really need to be paid the extra funds for them. And part of, I think, what was mentioned maybe in an earlier episode is how sometimes this kind of familiarity. I also used to be a domestic worker. I was a nanny for many years. And there's so much care and love you bring into the work you do. And that doesn't mean that care and love means that justice isn't done, right? And that there's a fair and equitable relationship. And so particularly for workers who are often taking care of their own families, overtime really impacts their ability to care for themselves and their families. So we've done trainings around it. We launched an overtime campaign, and over 550 families joined and said, we are going to have conversations about overtime and other key issues. And so this was in Brooklyn and in the city, but we are beginning here to really, really think about how can overtime and other issues that have been talked about on this podcast be really key issues to elevate the standards of care for domestic workers and for all of us.
Wow.
Yes. And I guess from the CRC perspective, we have been doing a series of Know Your Rights for domestic workers with the support of the National Domestic Workers Alliance and the WA, also with the Cornell Institute, Worker Institute, and also partnerships with Worker Justice Center, just to bring in a broad information about how domestic workers could be exercising their rights, understanding what overtime pay works, and also pay sick leave, which we have a law in Westchester County, but many of domestic workers and their employers are not aware of existing laws and how those could be enforced. So for us, informing domestic workers, training them how to exercise their rights, it's very important because they become advocates of themselves. And also they can have real conversations with their employers as to how, exercising their rights, it's important. And also for employers to understand that there's information out there that they are not aware of, and they should be, since, they're employing domestic workers.
You mentioned paid time off. Can you touch a little bit about that, and what does it look like in practice? How do employers ensure that they're compliant with paid time off regulations?
I think just like Janet said, an employer's taking on that initiative and consulting with an attorney who can educate them about that is probably the most important thing that they can do. And for sick pay, a worker in New York City and Westchester, they accrue up to 40 hours of time off. And then in greater New York State, it varies. And that's also why it's important for an employer to educate themselves, because it does matter where you are in the state. There are local laws that also govern. And then paid time off, if you, in the state of New York, if you've been working with the same employer for at least 1 year, then you get 3 paid days off.
How often should, similarly to paid time off is paid breaks during the day? How often should employers provide their domestic workers with rest or meal breaks? And is there a minimum duration for these breaks required by New York State law?
So generally, in one day, it's usually after 6 hours, a worker is entitled to at least 30 minutes of rest. It doesn't need to be paid. If a worker decides to work through that time, then obviously that time should be compensated. And another thing to note about rest time is it needs to actually be uninterrupted rest, right? So if it's your half-hour break, but you're still doing work in some capacity, that's not a real break, and you do need to be compensated for that time. But in a week, domestic workers in New York State need to have at least 1 full day, so 24 consecutive hours of rest. And again, a worker can choose to work that day, but it needs to be paid at overtime.
Yeah, I'll just add one quick thing, which is I think you underline the importance of why these conversations are so important, because care worker, domestic workers, particularly those working to take care of children or the elderly or folks with disabilities, it's challenging if you're the only one in the home to take a break. So often you may have to work through that break. So how does your employer understand that you're taking on those conditions? And then if so, what are other ways for rest to be taken? Are there other ways that can be negotiated for a worker to have some time on the phone to be able to kind of take rest in between? And so a lot of that is why the law provides such an important framework, but the law comes alive through the conversations. And so processes of negotiation and we call them care conversations, right? Because they're really about how we equitably care for each other. And those are so important, not just having them and in the initial time, but having check-in conversations. And we're in a complex political moment in the world. So things are changing, laws are changing, and it's really important. And as you talked about in other episodes, issues around immigration, other things are affecting how people feel comfortable and safe in their workplaces. And so how are we supporting employers to feel that they can go to the workers and say, I'm here, let's have a conversation? And how are we supporting workers to feel like they know their rights to do that too?
Yeah, absolutely. And also to remind ourselves that domestic workers have families too, and they also have responsibilities with their children or family members that maybe they are taking care of. So how do we humanize that side of the employee, and how employers understand much more that this is how they will be treating the other employees, for example, will be treated if they work in an office or in different industries in which employees get benefits, and they don't have to go through a number of conversations for their employers to understand that this is what their rights are. So I think that because of how informal domestic work is, it also enforcing labor laws, for these workers, it's hard because there is not that understanding that domestic workers are like other professionals in our community, and actually, we should be taking care of them much more because they take care of what is precious to us, which is our family, our children.
That's such a great point. Thank you for bringing that up. In terms of employers, are there any resources or organizations available that employers can use for guidance on properly managing work hours, overtime pay, and paid time off with their domestic workers to ensure that they are doing the right thing?
Yeah, I can just quickly name Care Forward works really closely with Hand in Hand, which is the National Domestic Employers Association, and they really have worked particularly as we talked about, as laws are changing, to really be responsive to ensure that employers have access to basic standard contracts. The Department of Labor has also put out standard contracts that employers can use, and use those resources for house cleaners, for elder care workers, for child care workers. So there's those local resources. Hand in Hand also and Care Forward have worked to create some standards boards in places where employers can go and get support around different issues that come up. There's connections to dispute resolution services, as well as just trainings. Like, my home is someone else's workplace. So what does that mean when your home is where someone's work is? How do you ensure that you're keeping those professional conditions and honoring their rights? So all those organizations are working really collectively, and I know CRC has been an incredible resource for the community at large.
Thank you. And yes, I mean, we have our worker center, and we, on a daily basis, we get calls from employers from many industries seeking workers. And what we do when we do those connections is we also provide employers with resources as to, what they should keep in mind in terms of minimum wage, overtime, and also other resources that maybe they don't know that exist in the community. We also partner with other local worker centers. We have the Alianza Laboral of Westchester, which is 5 worker centers that work together on a monthly basis to ensure that workers' rights are not violated, and if they are, that they could advocate, for those workers and seek some sort of remedies, if in case they are struggling with social injustice and so forth.
Thank you, and thank you guys for touching on that. I think that's all the time we have for today, but thank you all for coming and being here, and thank you all for your powerful work. So, and thank you to LMC Media for allowing us to produce this very, hopefully, powerful podcast. So thank you.
Thank you
Thank
for
you.
having
Thank you
us.
so much.